Hey, what's up, eighth grade? This is a distance learning lesson on causes of the U.S. Civil War. Although we're not going to be doing our Teams call for week one, we will pick up with it with week number 2 next week. Today, we're going to start the warm-up activity. We'll move to the main idea, talk about the causes of the Civil War, kind of reviewing some of the things that we talked about in class and that you have done independently. We'll then move on to the election of 1860, and we will conclude this screencast talking about what happens in Fort Sumter, South Carolina on April the 12th of 1861. There are a lot of causes of the American Civil War, and our main idea for today's screencast is that anti-slavery activists formed a new political party, the Republican Party, following the election of 1860. South Carolina, six other southern states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. In early 1861, Confederate troops fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, which will mark the beginning of the U.S. Civil War. Our essential question, something that we really want to think about here today, are what are the leading political, social, and economic factors that led to the Civil War? Here are some of the causes that we've already talked about. We started with the differences between the North and the South. We said it was like two different worlds, and a lot of this had to do with the economies. The North had industry, the South was primarily based in farming, which of course made them dependent on forced servitude, slave labor. The Missouri Compromise, 1820, was one of the first attempts to keep the Union together, admitting Missouri as a slave state, admitting Maine as a free state. The Compromise of 1850, Uncle Tom's Cabin, that novel that was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, the question of what to do about slavery in the territories. The Dred Scott decision, where basically the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that African Americans were not citizens, and therefore they were not protected by the Constitution. These are all causes, and I'm going to ask on the module that you're doing independently to formulate your opinion about what do you think was the most important. I think all of these are incredibly important causes, but historians also consider these causes as well. And some of the ones that we're going to be talking about here today, we talked about economics. I mean, the South depended on cotton and therefore on slave labor. In the South, there was always this belief that the Southern states wanted to be able to overpower the federal government. Southern states always believed that the states should have more power than the federal government. This continued in the 1800s as well. Slavery, again, a very broad category, something we talked about a lot here in 8th grade. And then the last one, which we'll talk about here today, is the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. And I think that's as good of a place as any to start. Abraham Lincoln called himself a prairie lawyer. He was from the small town of Springfield, Illinois, which in the early 1800s really was kind of the prairie, you know, the western extent of our nation. He was a successful lawyer in and around Springfield, Illinois. He had a term in the House of Representatives, but then later in 1858, he ran for the Senate. In 1858, when he ran for the Senate, it was in this newly formed Republican Party. It was a new political party that had emerged. A lot of the Republicans were anti-slavery. So he ran for Senate in his home state of Illinois. He was running against Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas was the architect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which we talked about earlier this year. He loses. Lincoln loses. He's defeated by Stephen A. Douglas. Stephen A. Douglas was the incumbent. He was a multi-term senator from the state of Illinois. So it was going to be really hard for a young challenger with a new political party to unseat him. But what ended up happening was that Douglas and Lincoln were debating around the state of Illinois, and a lot of it was about slavery. And Lincoln was against slavery, and he saw it as a moral issue. A moral issue is, right versus wrong. And Lincoln basically said it's wrong for humans to own other humans. He also favored what became known as the free soil in the territories of the West. And basically what they said was that any new lands in the West were free. It wasn't a question whether they should be slave or they should be free. They were free. And that whole idea of free soil was in opposition to what some people believed. And these debates weren't only about Illinois. They were really setting the stage for what would happen in 1860 between Republicans and Democrats in the election of 1860. And for Lincoln, he didn't want to, bring a divide between slave and free states. It was just kind of his views on what he thought on slavery was wrong. He didn't necessarily believe that everyone had to believe what he did. The senatorial campaign of Lincoln will make him a national figure. They're writing about Abraham Lincoln, this young guy running for Senate in the newspapers in New York and Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia. So in 1860, when the presidential election comes around, Abraham Lincoln will run. He will be the nominee for the newly formed Republican Party. Democrats actually split their party. John Breckinridge will be a Democrat that runs for the Southern Democrats. Stephen Douglas, the same guy that Lincoln was debating against in the election for senator in Illinois, will run as a Northern Democrat. And then John Bell runs as a constitutional unionist. So there are actually four candidates that run for the election of 1860. And there was a surprise fifth candidate, Joe Exotic. He ran as Libertarian. I'm just kidding. He didn't run. In 1860, this is how things unfold. Lincoln will carry all of the states in red. Breckinridge will carry the states in green. Bell will carry the states in orange. And Stephen Douglas wins the state of Missouri. Here's Stephen Douglas. But you can really see the divide. Look at northern states, vote Lincoln. Southern states, vote for Breckinridge. And the election of 1860 is what will eventually lead to the southern states seceding from the Union. Most southern states, all southern states, didn't even have Abraham Lincoln on their ballot. So secession is when you leave. It means you're seceding. You're giving something up. You're moving away. And the southern states had threatened secession for a long time throughout the 19th century. Lincoln's win in the election of 1860 fractured this already broken nation. State by state conventions were held. And eventually the Confederate States of America, or the CSA, were formed. December 20th, 1860, South Carolina becomes the first state to vote for secession, and they will write an articles of secession, and then 7 other states will follow suit within 3 months. And very, very quickly, you start to see a divided America as kind of this precursor to the U.S. Civil War. The first 7 states that secede: South Carolina, Mississippi. You'll be reading what Mississippi said and why they seceded in your online module. Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. These are the first 7. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina will also secede, but they will do this following a series of events that unfolds in April of 1861. Lincoln is not inaugurated until March. In the 1800s, presidents didn't assume office in January. They took office in March. So he's nominated in November. He wins the election in November. He's going to be inaugurated in March. There was this in-between time period because former President James Buchanan, who presidential historians will sort of categorize as one of the worst presidents America has ever had, did nothing after the southern states seceded. He just kind of let it happen. Lincoln viewed secession as unconstitutional. He didn't think that states should be allowed to leave the Union, but he also didn't favor using the army to enforce it. So he wasn't going to march Union troops into South Carolina or into Virginia or Texas and say, hey, you have to be part of the United States of America. But both sides kind of waited anxiously for what would happen next. South Carolina, in their articles of secession, they compared Lincoln's election to the Boston Tea Party. The tea has been thrown overboard. The Revolution of 1860 has been initiated. Things are kind of calm for a little while, and then in the early morning hours of April the 12th of 1861, there was a federal fort in the harbor of Charleston, surrounded by Charleston, South Carolina, and Confederate forces will open fire on the fort on April the 12th of 1861, which will mark the first shots of the U.S. Civil War. So it's kind of an overview for what you're going to be learning in this module. This is now time for your asynchronous learning. This is where you do it independently and individually. Complete the module posted in Canvas before we meet next Wednesday. Sorry, I didn't change that. It will be next Wednesday. This is our final Causes of Civil War material. Next Wednesday, we'll start the Civil War. It's Abraham Lincoln's biography, the election of 1860 discussion, a South Carolina secession SHAG activity, and a formative quiz on the causes. So just kind of a couple friendly reminders for you. I want to show you what this looks like. So if you click on Canvas and you go to our course here, 6th period, you'll want to click on the modules And then the module that you're looking for is going to be causes of the American Civil War. Click on that. Here's going to be the overview of what you need to do, sort of step-by-step directions. I also think it's important for you to know that there's a time goal here. I don't want you spending hours on this. This should take you 45 minutes to complete. After 45 minutes, you should be done with social studies and move on to whatever else it is that you want to do in your day. So please do not feel like this is something that should be taking a long time. It's about 45 minutes worth of work. Start with an Abraham Lincoln biography. There's a little video there from Biography About Lincoln. Move on to the election of 1860. Here's an overview of the election. Click on the discussion. That'll take you to the election of 1860 discussion. And it asks you to write a 2 to 3 sentence post about cause of the Civil War, which cause you think is the most important, explaining it, and then a sentence why you think that is the most important. So you're going to respond to that discussion. On the next page here, it talks about Southern secession, and what I have included is a declaration from the state of Mississippi. This is what they wrote to the federal government explaining why they were leaving the Union. Once you read over that, click on this link here. This is a SHEG Mississippi secession articles sourcing activities, the same format that we've used all year. Type a document, according to the document, why is Mississippi leaving? According to the document, how does Mississippi compare the election of Lincoln to America declaring its independence? Once you complete that, the last content piece is the bombing of Fort Sumter. Read over the bombing of Fort Sumter. There's a pretty good animated video here that shows you what happens at Fort Sumter. And then the very last thing in this module is a quiz. This is a couple questions. You may take as many times as you want. And again, this is formative. This is not going in the grade book. I just want you to know that when I look at your work, all I'm doing is checking off to see that you've done the discussion, that you did the SHAG activity, and that you did the formative quiz as well. So I miss our class. I was saddened that we were not able to have our live team meeting this week, but we will pick up with that next week. So go ahead, get started on the module. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I will be available, and I hope you ladies and gentlemen have a great weekend, and I will see you next Wednesday. Take care, everybody.